All right. So, welcome everyone. Hopefully you're in the right webinar. Today we're here to talk about why you're never happy with your note-taking system. And so yeah, my name's Ben Hong, and we'll be let's go through this. So for those who don't know me, here's a little fun fact about me. I love going to theme parks and these sort of things. And so this here is a photo from the Jurassic Park River Adventure ride from Orlando, Florida. And we're going to play a little bit of a Where's Waldo if can you find Ben. And if you can't, don't. I'm the guy up at the very back with both my hands up, just dropping. I think it was like 80 feet. I believe it was like just like this huge water drop. Awesome, tons of fun. Missed amusement parks, absolutely. Um, but don't worry for those who are wondering. This was taken way back in 2017. So as things get a little bit safer with the vaccine rollout and stuff, certainly can't wait to get back to seeing people and getting to go to theme parks. But in the meantime, just fond memories all around. Um, So a little bit about me. So I know for some of you, this is sort of like the first introduction as far as so on my day to day, what I do is I'm a senior developer experience engineer at Netlify, and basically what that means is I get to really help with the integration of software at Netlify and basically help the community as far as using it and improving the overall usage and experience of it, which is yeah. So um, and then for those who don't know, I do a lot of work in the open source community. So as a software developer, there's a JavaScript framework called Vue.js, which is one of the most popular frameworks. And so do a lot of work on the docs team and spend a lot of time there. So building things for the webs is a big part of my background. But some things that you might not know about is that my background is actually in industrial organizational psychology. So I don't have a classically computer science background. And more importantly, throughout my life, I'm kind of what was termed a serial hobbyist. So I kind of jump from thing to thing. Love learning new things. Like if you're passionate about it, I'd love to learn about it. And as a result, I think one of the challenges I've had growing up is that as you take notes and move from thing to thing, you kind of feel a bit fragmented sometimes, right? As far as how your ideas go, which is I think one of the reasons note taking and a lot of the ideas behind it are kind of so near and dear to me. So before we get started, I just wanted to reiterate to everyone that the slides will be made public after this because it's fairly easy for me to export. And then the talk will be recorded, and I'm just making sure. Okay, whew. I was like, for a second, did I forget to click record? The red blinking button is happening. So we are good. Talk is being recorded. And then, yeah, there'll be a live Q&A session at the end for anyone who has questions. So don't hesitate to ask about that. And actually, let me make sure my mic is on the right place. Perfect. Great. All right. So the first thing I want to ask is why do we take notes? And so one of the new tools I acquired recently is this tool called Mentimeter. And so I want to go ahead and where did it go? Oh, it moved somewhere. All right, so what this is going to let us do is, let me open up this presentation. All right, so for those who are on their computers, I'd love to have you all interact with this. And so basically what this is it's a way for you to basically add your responses. So here you go. So we're going to I'm going to drop this here. And this is a way for all of us to kind of see what everyone's thoughts are. So I'm curious from the audience, why do you take notes? Why are notes important to you? And so, yeah, I'm going to give a minute for people to hop on in and go ahead and. Okay, yeah, so we have from Leslie, right? The idea of losing ideas gives me anxiety. Absolutely, I feel that so much. I have a terrible memory. You see this? Oh, this is what I love about the tool, by the way. Getting to just see people's reactions live on the screen as it updates really helps to facilitate things. So memory is a big running theme. Um, Brains are for having ideas, not keeping them. I love that. To revisit later so I don't forget what's important during a meeting or class. Yep. Forgetting things. Snippets for reference. Self-admitted data hoarder. Yes, we're going to talk about quick capture, or capturing ideas. Absolutely. Organize thoughts to make it easier. Yeah, getting days organized with to-dos. This is wonderful. Um, so for those who have this open, we're gonna just go ahead and leave up the browser. I'm gonna switch back to slides so we can kind of talk through some things, and then there's a couple more interactive pieces we'll have just to kind of see how we're all feeling together as a group. Yeah, so you see Romina here saying, and the need to jot down things I read, watch, view, and create my own personal knowledge management system. So that's what PKM stands for those who might be newer to the realm. Great. Someone put to never read them again. It does feel like that, doesn't it? Um, Turning thoughts into value. Yeah, it helps me process, review. Yeah, so a lot of it seems like comes down to like really helping us analyze and take a look at how our brain functions with these different patterns. So with that said, thanks everyone for hopping in on that. Like I said, there'll be other ones in the future. And so some of the things I had sort of written down myself is that like it seems like the theme we're totally on the same wavelength here, right? We want to store information that we can retrieve later, right? That's really important. But more importantly, to be able to engage with material that makes it easier to remember, right? Especially for those people, taking classes right now, right? Taking notes means the difference between remembering something for a test and not. And so it engages the stickiness aspect of our memory. And more importantly, right, we saw another running theme, which was we want to be able to leverage work we've done in the past so we can actually move forward on new ideas, right? Nothing's more frustrating than thinking like, I had this idea at one point that I wanted to sort of dive deeper on, and I can't find it anywhere, right? I'm sure some of you have had that. If not, I'm speaking from personal experience. And finally, like really, as we talked about, like looking at our notes, the ability to navigate basically our own brain as we explore unfinished thoughts and ideas. I think that's a lot of like these are some of the central themes I've found when it comes to notes and why they're so important to us. And so let's talk a little bit about my own journey with what I'm calling traditional note taking. And so I started way back when with like Windows 95, and yes, for those who don't know what these are floppy disks. So you know the little icon you see for the save? Yeah, this was my organization system for taking notes. I had Microsoft Word documents as a kid that I would like write notes on, and then I had my floppy disks that were color coded, so that then they would store them on separate files. Like I had a whole thing with that, and it worked quite well as a kid. But you know, as time has gone on, right, I've obviously explored a lot of different apps, but this has been one of the challenging things. So I've gone from OneNote to Evernote. And then when Evernote's performance started slowing down, I switched like Apple Notes. I was trying like really lightweight solutions to, speed things up. As you can see, Dropbox Paper, Google Keep, for those who don't know. And the lower right here is Bullet Journal. Like one point I abandoned digital because I was like, no, pen and paper, that's how I'm going to engage, right? Like this is how we're going to do it. And then I found limitations with that. And Dynalist is the one on the bottom. And then, the Bear was the most sort of recent one. And so as you can see, I have tried a lot of tools. And to be honest, this isn't even all of them. I've even bought all sorts of gizmos and gadgets. Like at one point, for those like at university, I was using this pen that had like graph paper and there was like a camera in it. And when you would write on it, it would like record what the professor was saying. So you could like tap on the specific point where you're writing and like re-listen to the lecture. Like I have spent a lot of money and tried a lot of things trying to figure out how to get note-taking working properly in all forms and sizes. So trust me when I say I've tried a lot of different things. But here's the thing though, right? At the end of the day, traditional note-taking comes with the limitation that we're often thinking about things from the perspective of folders and documents, right? So we create a folder and we're like, okay, it's gonna belong here. And when we first get started out, that feels really good because we're feeling like we're organizing things. But here we have actually like this is an actual screenshot of my Evernote setup at one point. And so if we zoom in a little bit here, what you see here is that we have a series of notebooks in Evernote. And basically, if we think of the notebooks, for those who haven't used Evernote, they're basically like folders as well. So you're basically saying, hey, these notes belong to this notebook. That's really the general idea. But the problem is that you'll see here at the time I had like a Ben Code Zen stack. So for those who don't know, that's like basically part of my coding branding. And so anything that I learned with development. And so I had like things for my personal site under Ben Code Zen. I had coding interview notes, different ideas for blog posts. But then I also had this like, I was also an avid Go player. So for those who don't know, that's like Paruk or Wei Chi. Which is basically like that you'll see it played on the TV shows like the White and Black Stones. Not Othello, it's the other thing. And so the problem is that you'll see that then I had like Element 84, which is the company that I worked at before, and all the things that we did. And the problem is like I had sort of organized them by like these sort of areas of concerns. But a lot of times I found frustration in like, where does a note go when it applies to two different places, right? What happens when I have a blog post idea that's also related to Element 84? Or I have a Go thing that like I'm building something for Go. Now it's like it's got this weird place, right? And I think that's what a lot of us have encountered when it comes to the rigidity of folders, is that we're limited in what we can actually do because information often can be tracked and is useful across multiple axes rather than just a single scope of like when we first create it. And so this works great up until a certain point. And so I don't know if this is an official term, but I'm calling it like the point at which it stops working is what I call the information tipping point. Because the thing about a lot of note-taking apps in my experience is that you end up finding that when you first start out, it's really great, right? The software is really lightweight and you're working, you're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. But then the moment you start hitting points of like massive information like input, and you're working with really complex scenarios that are personalized to your lifestyle, your workflow, you start to find that, oh, this is not as smooth as I thought it would be. And so let's like do a little trip back memory lane for those. Does anyone remember waiting in line at like a Barnes and Noble or a Borders for like the release of a book? Right? Like growing up, I think information input was a lot simpler at the time. So I think I think I did this for the last Harry Potter book. Was like I went to the bookstore and I got the one. And what did I do? Like I inhaled the book when I got back and like, did my notes and like really resonated with it. And here's the thing though, right? Is that like it was a simpler time. And so like in the terms of like you could focus really on specific media. So like growing up, I had specific books I had that I reread and I looked at over time because there's only so much information to kind of take in at once. And so having all my notes organized by floppy disks, by simple folder structure actually worked out quite well because the scale wasn't quite there. But I went ahead and looked at this morning. Like here are all the different books I'm reading simultaneously in my Kindle right now. And I don't think this is all of them. I just grabbed some of them that are like basically present on mine that I've basically been jumping between. Because let's be honest, I don't know if anyone else has this problem, but a lot of times like you have different areas that like require the attention of like, I'm gonna read this for a bit, and then your friend's like, oh, but I'm also reading this. You're like, oh, I want to read. Okay, I'll read this with you, and then you like sort of like trying to multitask and juggle these ideas. But all of a sudden, note taking becomes very different because you're constantly shifting from context to context. And as in my experience, like I know the general convention is basically like just do the one thing and then move on each time. And then there's also like the complete other end of like the spectrum, which is like do everything, and then eventually you burn out, and then you go back to doing one thing. And I'd like to help, like, I love the conversation to get a little bit more nuanced. So, like, how about this middle ground of like, how do we juggle in the age of information? How do we deal with all this? And so here is like and so we're in like what is known as the information age, right? We have all kinds of things coming at us from all sorts of mediums, whether it's social media, email, text, and on top of that, your RSS feeds, your podcasts, your books. I mean, I haven't even named it all, like video courses, like the list goes on and on. And more importantly, we're more connected with people like more so than ever. So in the past, some of you might remember a time where you could memorize everyone's phone number that was like close in your circles. And now it's like there's just so many people that you're often involved with as you pick up new hobbies and interact with online communities that it can be hard to keep track of everything. And so so Mo mentioned so The Key Personal Influence. That's a great book that I'm definitely working through. And so when it comes to browsing the internet, for example, right? Like this is for those who don't know, this is like the iPhone, like when you're looking at multiple tabs. And so if we think of notes and our ideas as we traverse information, right? In our perfect world, if you think about it, it's kind of like the burger model we see here, where like we start with the top hamburger bun, then we like move to the lettuce, the tomato slice, the patty, and then the bottom. And this is like ideally what our notes and thoughts would feel like. But I don't know about y'all, but it's a bit more like this meme when it comes to, I think, navigating the web and information, which is my mind is like my internet browser. I have 19 tabs open. 3 are frozen, and I have no idea where the music is coming from. I see in the chat 19 rookie numbers. Yeah. So it's this is I think this resonates a lot with us, and because to be honest, I feel like this is how notes are a bit. We take notes in different places. We have post-it notes, and we're trying to figure out like, oh, we got to take notes on this, and then we're gonna put it here, and the next thing you know, you have it scattered across various areas, and you're like, gosh, well that's frustrating. I don't know where anything is anymore. um, so here were my frustrations that I found with traditional note taking. And so to sum it up, like the truth is that it doesn't scale with the information age, with all the various inputs we have, and performance becomes an issue, right? One of the most again, I was a hardcore Evernote user for a long time, but at one point it took so long to start up the software. And let's be realistic here. When I say it takes so long, it might have been to the tune of like, oh that's loud. Hang on a sec. Note taking, please. Joys of living in the city. Um, okay, here we go. So I'll just do a quick snap for myself editing later. Um, okay, so what I was saying was regarding when I was using Evernote, when I'm talking about performance, I'm talking like it would take like maybe 10 to 20 seconds to start up the app. But when it comes to that level of speed, like if you think about note taking, we want the speed to our tools basically should work as fast as we think. That's like a big philosophy for me when it comes to note taking, is because if you have to wait 10 seconds, even 10 seconds, just to write something down, at that point you might have lost momentum on things. And as we know, a lot of times momentum carries us when we're writing notes. From one idea, we jump to another. And so having even the smallest bit of latency when it comes to that can be absolute killer. And so the other thing too, as well, is I felt the inability to compose ideas freely, in that I would have one idea in one document and another one in somewhere else. And when I wanted to cross-reference them, I felt like I was duplicating the work a lot of times. And then let alone that, could I tell in the future if I wanted to change one thing, how it would impact everything else, let alone like what's outdated and those and such. And so, there's this great meme from this is from, oh gosh, Zootopia. And this is the sloth. For those in case you can't see the video, he's just very slowly stamping the paper. And that's how it feels like sometimes, right? With note-taking apps, especially when they start to slow to a crawl. And gosh, isn't that frustrating? And so when the apps gets like, this is what I was talking about in terms of scale, right? And this is one of the things where I think a lot of new note-taking apps are starting to rethink their consideration of performance, because a lot of us are working with really large, basically like second brains, and personal knowledge management. And so, when it comes to a slow app, that's almost the first thing I basically abandoned it. And that's why I think at one point I did go to pen and paper, because I don't have to worry about boot up time and like saving to a disk. Like once I wrote it down, it was done. Um, and so how about let's talk about modern note taking then, right? I talked about traditional. We're going to talk about modern note taking. And when I say modern, I'm going to skip back a bit in time into like the basically early 1900s, which is a guy some of you may know about, Nicholas Lumen. And he's really big in the note taking community because he popularized this concept that we now know as the Zettelkasten. And I have friends who I forget, I think it's a German word, and really all Zettelkasten mean is note box. Like it's not fancy, but that's what that's what his note taking system was basically a series of note boxes. And so to give you like a quick anatomy of it, basically what he would do is he would have a single index card, and he would write his idea down on it. And then the key thing here is he would give it this identifier. So in this case, this was like a number 1, for example. And then what he would do is he would relate the notes to each other by basically writing like references, right? Like 1 connects to 1.2, and you can kind of see how it works. Now, granted, this is done with pen and paper, which to me is absolutely astounding, when it comes to like the level of dedication he had. If you can imagine, like when you want to look for notes, like manually pick them out, link them together, and like assemble them, right? That's like a ton of dedication. But believe it or not, I think at the height of his career, he had about 90,000 index cards. And with that, he wrote over 70 books and over 400 articles. I think about that, and that's astounding to me. Again, we're talking about pen and paper, right? We haven't talked about computing, which is why, like, I think the software part of it is very interesting because if he could do that with pen and paper, imagine what we can do with like apps that are tuned to do this well. And so, what you'll hear about is what I'm sort of talking. Let me rewind a little bit. What you'll hear about a lot with sort of what we call modern note taking is the idea of atomic notes. And so what are atomic notes? Well, put simply is that notes like the index card, which are like ideas encapsulated at its smallest unit of useful value. So rather than think of it as like length or anything, it's just like whatever the most useful unit is at the time that you're writing it. And so with notes, right, over time, what you tend to happen is you have your first idea, you have your second idea, and you have your third idea, and these exist as independent notes. But over time, what happens, right? You're going to start building on those things. So you can see 2 goes to 2A, to 2B, to 2C. And then naturally, you might have things that kick off of 1A to 1B to 1C. Now, with traditional note-taking models, what you probably would do is you'd have a single like document, for example, that would be idea 1, and you would just keep adding to it and appending to it. And same thing with 2, right? You down A, B, and C. But the question is, what happens now if you want to go ahead and connect ideas that are from different areas? And so 2A actually wants to reference 1C, which then references 1A, down to 3, and then down to 2C. Right? With traditional notes, this is hard to do without like basically doing a rough copy and paste between things. But like a lot of times, this is how we often assemble and synthesize ideas, is that we take things from different areas and we bring them together all into one flow. And so the tricky part is then obviously like what happens now when you have a line of thought for like document 4, for example. Well, for document 4, you might actually need a point where like you actually want 1C to be referenced in both places. And so once again, like I sort of talked about earlier, traditional note-taking tools would limit you to a copy-paste sort of like janky setup. But really, note-taking tools should be like facilitating this idea that like if you have one thing, you shouldn't have to worry that if you update it inside of your document in 4, that it will then all of a sudden make the line of thought in 2A out of date. And so what you really want is for them to basically be able to reference one place and then break it out into others. And so this is really like the power of atomic notes. And again, we only have so much time today to talk about these things. So I just wanted to at least start presenting these ideas and get you thinking a bit about why it's important, as you'll see more and more with notes and relationships, why it's so important for these things to exist in that way. And so let's talk about the core principles that I've basically established for my own note-taking system, and love to hear your thoughts on things with that going forward. Now, let me go ahead and shift slides here. There we go. And so I'm actually curious, before we get into this, back in Mentimeter, like what note-taking apps have people used in the past? I'd love to kind of get a sense of what people are using. Sorry, not this. Here we go. Evernote, Notion, OneNote. Here we go. And so for those wondering what you're seeing on the screen, so this is basically our word cloud that you see, which is this is probably my favorite feature when it comes to Mentimeter, is being able to allow people to just sort of show just like the interaction of things. Wow, people are using WhatsApp for notes. Oh, that's fascinating. Yep, I see foam, pen and paper, bullet journal. Yeah, lots of things here. Samsung Notes, IA Writer. This is great. Evernote is a clear winner, though, as far as this word cloud is considered. Nice to see Notion also being represented. Bear, OneNote, Obsidian. This is awesome. All right. Okay. This goes what? Yeah, I noticed that some chat apps actually have a dedicated note-taking feature, which I found really interesting too. Evan here saying that he has a note app buying problem. I resonate with that so much. Evan. Okay, wonderful. All right, so now that we've covered that, let's talk about some of the principles that I've found. Although actually, before we do that, I forgot. I do have one more question for you all that I'd love to hear about, which is what frustrates you about note-taking, right? We've talked a lot about like why we do it. And so now that I've shared some of my experiences with frustrations, I'd love to hear what you wish your app could do for you, right? And hearing those things, right? Cool. So people are organization. This is how many paper notebooks I own. Gosh, I think I just cleaned it up, but for whoever wrote that, yeah, I have a lot of paper notebooks ever as well. How to make messy in progress notes, finding the right note. Yeah, slow to open, slow to search. Yeah, performance is huge when it comes to note taking. I think this is why a lot of people do like the reliable pen and paper, as far as like being able to quickly, uh, jot things down. Now, granted, searching through paper can be a little bit more trickier, and that's some of the limitations I found. But I think we're gonna figure it out. Owning your content. I love that. Yes, I'm gonna be totally touching on that. Notes in too many places, forgetting to use it. Link ideas, smart search, slow. Can't search unless digital. Yep. It's really tricky. The note taking space. Okay, this is good. All right. So one of the things about this particular talk that I'm giving today is that you'll probably notice that I actually haven't talked anything about like a specific software, because I think what's really important here is that when it comes to note taking, there are these general principles that we all can benefit from, regardless of the app that we use and how we do things. And I think we can find really clever ways once we have those ideas. So thanks to everyone for contributing to this. Let's talk about core principles for note taking. Untitled one for the win. Gosh, yes, I have a lot of those as well. Okay. So principle number one, to me, is your notes, your ideas, and your brain. And someone actually mentioned this inside of that earlier, which is like ownership of data. And one of the things that I don't think is discussed enough lately when we talk about tech, right, is that actually it's being discussed a lot, but particularly within the note-taking realm, I think it's almost like omitted for whatever reason. Is that data privacy, when it comes to your notes, to me, is more important than almost anything else, right? Like, yes, it's weird that if you're letting Google track your location, and some people disable that, and we're worried about getting hacked. But then it's funny that like I think a lot of the services we see offering to host your notes, they're basically saying like put your most intimate ideas out for like possible consumption. And then so here's a tweet from MacBook Miller that was recently April 6th that says, yet another note-taking app raises a $5.6 million seed round. So basically they raised $5.6 million from venture capitalists. And let's read the TechCrunch article and try to figure out why. And so let's go ahead and zoom in on here. And it says, as you see in the highlighted portion, it says, the broader hope of the founders and investors behind MEM is that the team can leverage the platform's intelligence over time to better understand the data dump from your brain and likely other information sources access across your digital footprint to know you better than any ad network or social media graph does. Now I want to let that sit for a minute, because while I don't think mem is unique, I don't think this is unique to this specific app. I think this is actually true across a lot of the note-taking apps we often give our data to. And what's tricky about it is that I feel like a lot of people are, weirded out by having things like voice assistants in like their homes, and they're afraid of like their photo libraries getting hacked. But then, gosh, this is about as intimate as it gets, right? When we talk about like people like our phones. When we talk about our phones like listening to us and presenting us with ads, imagine what happens when you dump your entire brain onto this thing and someone hacks it and gets access to it. Like, that's terrifying. And yeah, that was actually pretty funny. And so the thing I think it's important to consider here with note taking is that this is really the most intimate source of information about you that could possibly exist on the internet. So one, even if you're using a third, someone that is hosting your data online, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be conscious of the fact that if they have a data breach, those things are the things that could go public. So for example, one of the things I use Notes to do is managing like relationships with people. So I take notes on like the things that we talk about and like basically like personal conversations that I have. I honestly wouldn't want that being scraped by someone if they like hacked into it. And it's one of the reasons why for me data privacy is so important. And so, if you're using a third-party software where that like basically vulnerability exists, it is something to keep in mind as far as what kind of information you're keeping on there. Because while we all want to believe in the good of people, like there are bad actors, and when that does happen, it can be basically difficult to contain. Um, so, principle number 2. Speed is essential for note-taking workflows. As I showed earlier with this meme, right? The last thing you want to do when you're capturing notes is to have to wait for the software to load or for something to happen. You want your tools to work as fast as your brain can, because that's the way you can really facilitate the flow state of creating and iterating on ideas. Okay. And so principle number 3 here is that context is critical when it comes to capturing information. I'm sure we've talked about this. Like, how many of us here have really we've gotten article recommendations that we've bookmarked, we've had tweet threads that we've been meaning to read, so we throw it somewhere in an inbox to read, and we basically have this pile of bookmarks waiting to be read. But truth is, we're probably never going to get around to it. And what's worst is that like a week later, when you're like, huh, there was this thing that I wanted to check out, you can't find it anymore. And so my sort of recommendation here is that whenever you're capturing information, rather than just merely bookmarking it, basically you want to always ask the question and spend the time to answer, why was this important enough for me to spend time to capture? Because if you can't spend the time to capture the emotions and the relevance of it in the moment, the odds of you finding it later on are much, much less likely. And I have some like basic principles here to help with this. And so the 4th principle here is that redundancy is key to retrieving ideas. One of the things that I've noticed a lot with note-taking is that we often forget that when we're writing the note, we have a very specific focus in mind. It's why when we organize things and put things in specific folders, we think that we're being organized. It feels like we're organizing. And we're like, but the mindset that you have at the moment, at the time at which you write the note, is often going to be very different from the mindset you have when you retrieve the note. And so, because after all, right, it can be days, weeks, months, and even years sometimes before you want to retrieve an idea. And so if you don't have ways to figure out like different connections into that, like that point of capture for that idea, you're basically never going to find it. And so when it comes to retrieving notes, I like basically the 5 W's of retrieving notes. And one of the things I always like to do is a lot of times ideas are, for me, connected to people. And so I'll remember that a friend of mine recommended something to me, and that's how I want to look something up. And so who inspired me is a question I asked. What sparked my interest? So what specifically about this thread, right? What about this article was like, because it was related to this other thing that I'm trying to do. And that way, again, you have this additional data, like entry point into the idea. And so location is even a thing too. Like, where was I at the time? And I don't necessarily mean like, I was sitting in like the kitchen when I had this idea. Although for those, maybe that is something that triggers, right? That you have a coffee house that like you had an idea in, and that's what you want to track. But more importantly, actually, the where was I for me often is connected to a certain event. So I might be attending a webinar, I might be attending a class. And so that way I can find it through that. Like, oh, I had an idea from a class, let me backtrack that through. And the other thing is like, when did I take this note? Because again, as long as we have a vague sense of when something happened, we can go, last month I did something. And again, the software should hopefully help you take care of these sort of basically queries. And of course, finally, it's like, why did I take this note? Which is similar to the what sparked my interest, but it's one of those things where like when we can start to get better attuned to like the inspiration behind what drives us to things, I think over time we'll find that we can better tell whether or not there's value in keeping a certain note. And so I'll show you how I do all of these things with my note-taking system. But before I do that, the final principle I want to touch on is that the foundation for gaining new insights on our ideas really exists in the relationship between ideas rather than the individual notes themselves. And I think that's what we're seeing with the big shifts basically towards note-taking systems that can show things like backlinks and how things are related over time. This is the key here, because when things exist in silo, it's really hard to connect those ideas. And so what we see here, once again, with the Evernote example that I gave earlier, right? When things existed in separate notebooks, it was hard to see what that was like. But what I'm going to show you here is, this is a screenshot of my Obsidian graph view. So Obsidian is the note-taking app that I use. And so here I'm going to go ahead and play this for you all. And what you see here is that you have a bunch of white circles which represent individual dots, and they're basically individual notes. And over time, right, when you start creating relationships between things, you develop basically this graph that shows you like what like how things relate to one another and how strong they are, because you'll notice that, for example, the notes are like the circles are different sizes because the data viz tool allows you to show like how strong those relationships are, because some notes, if they're connected by a lot of different things, show that there's a strong like correlation there of like something you keep revisiting. And being able to identify this in a visual way can be incredibly powerful, for really navigate. Like this is what we're talking about, right? Navigating ideas. What better way to navigate than to see things in a visual way? And so let's go ahead and I'm going to open up Obsidian and talk about some of those things. And so, when I take a new note, for example, and let's go ahead and let's say New York Times. There was this article recently that someone had recommended to me regarding technology. So let me do NY Times Tech. And so here in tech, okay, so here we talk about, let's talk about this particular article, for example, right? Regarding like big tech. And so typically what I would do, you might just bookmark this in the browser. But for me, on what I like basically got in the habit of doing is I have this structure using like basically what we talked about. So the first thing I do is I make the note, I basically give the title of the article. So in this case, I'll just call it Big Tech Power. And let me rotate the header here so that people, there you go. This is the title of the note. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and jot some things down. So one is I have a template that I can jot down, which immediately creates like basic attributes about the note. So you can see here, it creates like an identifier here, when it was created, when it was last updated. So these are like fields here to track. And then I also have a template for things that I want to track in the footer. So this is where I can sort of tell relationships in these things. So I have, like, for example, the location of the article here. And so here I have my link to New York Times. And then let's say, for example, like, my friend Hung Soo here is on the webinar. And so let's say this was an article that he recommended. Well, this is something where I can tag Hung Soo to this article. And so actually I just realized, let me go ahead and open up the graph view to this. And you'll see here that Big Tech Power right now exists in a vacuum, which makes sense, right? There are no relationships being generated by it right now. But the moment I tag Hung Soo as someone who recommended this article to me, there is that relationship that is suddenly created between the two. And so for those wondering, this syntax here is what is called wiki links. And so it's basically a syntax for creating like simple links between things. And what's great about this now is that you can start I can start tagging things appropriately, right? Like I can say that this is the type, for me, this is what I consider like an article. And then the mode here, I have a whole thing on modes, but like basically this is like my research mode for like learning new things. And then different topics that it's related to, right? So some of this should look actually familiar for a lot of us who have used note-taking apps as far as tagging and those sort of things. But what's nice about this is, let's say this is about topic of tech, is we can display, let me see, groups, filters, tags. So one, you'll see that here, we start to see the tags that are related, but then we can actually increase the depth in which things are related. So you can see here now that big tech is related here. And as you can see, I have, Hung Soo and I talk about notes a lot, so we can see a lot of different ideas populating through here. But then things start to branch out. And this is what I think is really interesting about the note-taking apps in the future, is that we're starting to see ways of how do we show those relationships in a way that allows us to organically take it, again, like answering the question, who was it recommended by, but then creating those relationships for me so that it's not more administrative work. And so some of you might be wondering though, like what is powering this, right? Like what is Obsidian exactly? And I'm not here to give a pitch. I'm here to illustrate why these principles work well for me in Obsidian. And so the first thing that you might be wondering is like, okay, so is this like something I like install? Is it on the cloud? The brilliant thing about Notes here is that, Obsidian, is that actually all it is it is a series of like text files, specifically Markdown, that exists on your computer. Like that is its starting point. In other words, like you get to choose, like you own the data entirely. There's no syncing to a third party. What Obsidian does is it analyzes a bunch of text files that you have, and then it does its thing, and it builds on top of it. And I think hopefully as we talk more about this, in other sessions and stuff, that we'll start to see really why this is important, because what this allows you to do then is you can control now as like principle number one, right? Your data is your idea, your brain. You can control what you want to publish. You can say that like, okay, you know what? These things are worth sharing. So now I choose to share them. Whereas when we entrust them to like a third party, there's no guarantee that at any point we wouldn't be exposed for certain sensitive data that we basically can't afford to have it exposed. And so let me drop the Obsidian link in here. And so some of the people actually are talking about VS Code Foam, which is another example of a similar idea, which uses the Visual Studio Code editor, which a lot of developers use, as a way to also do similar things. One of the reasons I prefer Obsidian over VS Code is that Obsidian actually has like a team working on it that's like basically full time. And the fact that Obsidian is free and it's still in beta and it's as good as I definitely really love the software. I think says a lot about where it's going, and I think well worth investing into. And so anyhow, okay. So now that we talked about some of these things, we start to see when it comes to note taking, right? Why like these principles that we talked about here in terms of like, let's go to the overview, right? Ownership of ideas, right? Providing context when capturing information. Because the beautiful thing about this now is that if in the future, I'm like, I had this article that I think Hangsu recommended me, like I could open up the graph. I could open up my graph to say like, okay, let's filter down to Hangsu. And I could say, hey, like from there, I could then talk about like, I think there was something about big tech. And then you can see here, oh, this is interesting. Okay, so it actually was able to like get me down to the graph that's related to it. And that's what I think over time, as we see like search get more sophisticated in those sort of things, because Obsidian still is in development, we can see some pretty powerful things. And so that's like principle number two, right? Is that when you have context to why something, like how something became important to you, it's much easier to retrieve it regardless of like what your motivation is at the time. And so that boils down to the redundancy bit as well, in terms of like, once you start relating things, right? We'll see here that, let's go to the big tech power again. Let's say we had a sample from that article, right? That I'm gonna say, let me go back. I'm just gonna, okay, this is not, okay, I'm just gonna assume this, okay, here, I'm just gonna take this paragraph right here. Okay. So when you're taking notes in here, one of the things as well is like, as you create relationships, we talked about speed and be able to flow, right? Refactoring notes is one of the things that I think is really important to the flexibility of things. So I talked about it, oh, we're talking about relationships, right? Sorry, I lost track of things. When I talk about refactoring notes, let's go ahead and take a look at the Think Again by Adam Grant, which is a book that I've been reading. And so you can see here is that I've like made a couple of ways that I'm going to reference it, right? The fact that it's a book, it's something I'm actively reading, who the creator is, and like how I got to it, right? Like I happened to stumble upon this because it was on the bestseller list. And what's really cool about, I think, apps as they start to think of like the experience of writing notes is that, let's say, for instance, that like this piece right here, this summary is something we want to reference in multiple places. Well, what we can do is we can go ahead and highlight this. And so we can actually refactor the note. And so what that does is it creates an entirely, whoops, let's see what just happened. Let me refactor that. There we go. It creates an entirely different file that contains like what you want to split out into a new note. So typically this would be done by like creating a new note, copying and pasting, creating the file. But this has been automated now to the point where like I can now update, like, so here it is in its single form. And then if I embed it in here on the left, again, you'll see that I still have the summary here. And the brilliant part of this is that if I create a new note now, where today we're talking about, let's say like note-taking webinar, creating an, like linking these two together is as simply as having this, bringing up the document you want. And then when you have it here, you'll see that, boom, this has been embedded in two different places. So I can see it here. It's also here. And so now if I update it to say summary 123, for example, you'll see that it's updated on the document on the left and it's updated on the document to the right. And so this is where we get that sort of single source of truth bit now, right? When it comes to uh, basically like being able to share ideas across notes. And again, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of like how Obsidian works, but really the intention here is to start having you all think about how this could apply to your own notes, right? When it comes like, even if you're using paper and pencil, how to collect things in a way that can be reused and like aggregated in a way that's useful to you. Because some people like the digital just doesn't work for them. And similarly, I don't think this means that you need to abandon your note-taking apps for Obsidian, because again, what your use case for your notes vary greatly. But if we can focus on these sort of ideas of ownership, context, redundancy, and being able to flow with things like naturally, I think you'll end up tailoring like the note-taking system that's perfect for you. And I think that's honestly why a lot of note-taking systems are tricky for people to wrap their heads around, because a lot of times you start with this opinionated piece that comes from someone else for their workflow, and eventually you find ways to outgrow it. And unless you're equipped with the key principles that allow you to be flexible and adapt it to what's important to you, oftentimes you'll hear people that they're like, I just gave up on note taking because it was just so much work, right? And then it was just like the return on investment just wasn't there. Um, and so I think let me go ahead and wrap up at least with the resources, and then I want to hop into Q&A in sort of the last 10 minutes that we have together. And so if there's one book that I would recommend that people check out when it comes to sort of the note taking here, is the How to Take Smart Notes by Dr. Sonk Arens, which is a really great like sort of insight into the world of note taking, and like where a lot of like you'll see like the productivity note taking community, a lot of the ideas kind of like were inspired from this because he has sort of collected these resources together. So with that said, let's take some time to look at the Q&A that we have. I see some stuff in the chat. So let's do this. Okay. So last had a question regarding templates and refactor. Yes, that happens all within, some of the templating is within Obsidian and some of it is within Obsidian plugins. And so that's one of the reasons I also really like the Obsidian community as well, is that it's fairly easy to extend upon. So for those talking about customization, that was originally going to be one of my principles in here, but being able to personalize your note-taking app to what makes the most sense for you. So for example, I'll show you here, I have a whole folder of templates that over time I've sort of accumulated that are basically reusable pieces of content that show up again and again. So for example, if I'm in the middle of a meeting, right? One of the things I do is I drop the metadata, right, the top of it. And then I drop things like, okay, what was the agenda today, right? The agenda was to be like review list. And I can say that, okay, let me drop a section for my notes. And these are my notes. And then one of the things, again, I told you, I manage like relationships, right? And I'm curious, like when did I participate in certain things with certain people? So I might be, for example, like, oh, maybe Hung Soo was in this meeting, for example. And then I have my footer to like aggregate those things, right? And so the templating is a huge part of speeding up workflow so that, again, you're not bogged down by the redundant piece of like setting things up constantly. And that's, I think, what I love in particular about the digital medium is that for me, for example, bullet journaling was extremely, like, I was really good at it. But then once I scaled past like the months that I had been doing it, it was hard to sort of reference things without it sort of feeling like a chore, because I had spent so much time like recording things down. And I wanted the ability to just like say, okay, this is my template, this is what I want, rather than having to sort of redraw it out every month, which, don't get me wrong, for those who have the creative artistic ability to create those beautiful landing pages and find it to be cathartic, like absolutely, I recommend keep doing it because that's what's best for you. But for me, I found that it ended up being frustrating for me. So being able to create custom templates here for things like, for example, what are another section I did, right? Different, so like logging. Sometimes like when I'm logging entries for different things, different projects, I have a whole thing like specific emojis, specific headings, and that kind of thing. Okay, so we have quite a few questions. Let me go backwards. Um, okay, so let me go back a little bit. This was state. Da, da, da. All right. Graph utilization. Okay. Okay, so Taste had a question regarding, can you talk about how you use the folders in Obsidian as well? Do you usually create the notes in the root and then eventually move them to folders? So actually, within Obsidian, I actually try to keep everything in a single folder as much as humanly possible. So currently, all my folders, most of my notes basically exist within the Zettelkasten folder. And so the reason like folders are useful is that it makes it very easy to ignore certain things. So in the graph, for example, I had shown here. So here's like let me clear out the filter. So here's like the giant graph. And so part of this is I didn't get a chance to talk about is daily notes. So I have like basically like my daily entry of the things I've done and what I try to track to kind of add timestamps to notes. But what I've done is I've kept all of that in a reports folder because a lot of times like I don't necessarily want all that like time data. And so by simply like subtracting the folder away from the graph, you'll see that now it's actually it's a lot simpler because when you timestamp things, there's just so many relationships happening to it. But now this is just the ideas without the context of time. And so that's how I use the folders as basically a way to like encapsulate certain areas that I know that are going to be like most likely ignored. So for example, I might have like a work folder. That might be another example of how I might use it. Okay, so Linda had a question. If you're not around your main machine as a database, how do you write those notes and add them to your database later? Okay, great. Great question, Linda. So when it comes to backing up your data, right, some people are probably thinking like, oh gosh, if it's just a folder on my machine, what happens if I lose everything? Well, redundancy is actually quite easy to do. I basically have my vault synced on Dropbox. And so that's one layer of protection. And then two, the way I also back it up is I actually have a private GitHub repo, which is for those who aren't familiar with GitHub, is basically a repository to store code. But rather than storing code, I'm just storing text files. And so that's private and locked down on that area. So for me, I have basically two fail safes. And for those wondering about so basically adding notes, basically the Obsidian mobile app is actually in development. So this is actually another reason why I like Obsidian over like Foam, for example, is that we have people actively developing like these sort of products that I just wouldn't have time and to like wait for an open source developer to work on. And so the mobile app is being developed, but also actually next week, I'll be hosting a live stream event for those who want to learn about this. So I'm taking over my coworkers channel, Learn with Jason, and we're gonna be where's the schedule? Yeah, so right here. So on April 27th at 1:30, we'll be talking about workflow automation with N8N. And so this is for developers who would love to learn about creating custom workflows. And basically what we're going to do is Matt's going to teach us how to basically use an app like Telegram. And when you message Telegram, you can tell it like basically custom commands, and it will update your note vault with like whatever it is you want it to update with like the templates and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm super excited about this because when you talk about personalization, like that's exciting. And so I guess since I'm also here as well, for those who want to get more of a deeper dive into Obsidian, Hung-Soo and I will be also hosting on Thursday, April 29th. So check that out. I'm going to drop this schedule in the chat. But excited to have that for people. And then let's see. Yeah, so see, I'm going to go a little bit backwards. So Cam's had a bit here regarding feeling lost. Yeah, this is, I think, one of the challenges right now with a lot of note-taking systems is that it almost seems like they basically need to come with a gigantic manual. And so in my own personal development, I'm looking into either developing extensions or ways to go beyond that. Because for like infrastructure, like for tools like Realm and even Obsidian, arguably, there is a bit of a learning curve, right? Because, for example, one of the things that I take for granted is that as a software developer, I'm very familiar with Markdown. And so I can be like, here's my title, here's my second idea, here's my bullet points, like 1, 2, 3, and here's my list items for like milk, ramen, and bubble tea. And what this ultimately translates for those who are wondering, like this renders out like this. This is the more traditional, like what you're used to seeing, right? Especially on for those coming from Notion, being able to see just whatever you're typing, it's just rendered properly. Obsidian at this point, at least at this point in time during beta, requires knowledge of Markdown. I believe they're working on a WYSIWYG editor, which stands for what you see is what you get. And that way you can have a bit more of a Notion experience. So this is why I'm so excited for the fact that the team for Obsidian, even at its zero, like in its beta phase where it's not even released officially as a version 1, has so much like power and potential as far as like, and I see them actively engaging with the community, which is amazing. And so for that reason, like really looking forward to see what like Obsidian kind of grows into. But yeah, hopefully over time we can make these things like more automated for people so that they don't feel like they have to learn everything from scratch. That's one of the criticisms I have of like the note-taking philosophy right now, is that it almost requires you to learn every little piece to figure out how it works. Victor has a question here regarding like thoughts on things like Rocketbook. I don't think I've used Rocketbook. Oh, I am familiar with this. I believe if it's what I think it is. Yeah, okay, I did think about this. Yeah, I'm actually in the process of experimenting with a lot of these physical mediums. So I have a Remarkable 2 tablet, and trying to figure out like how to integrate things, because one of the things I don't do as well that I know my friend Hung Soo does is that you can actually integrate images and stuff in here. So I think I did this for the Dune book. Did I do it? No, I think maybe I did it for I think I did it for how to take smart notes. But you can embed images inside of your notes to make it basically a lot more visually appealing and add more visual context. But definitely something I need to get better at. So yeah, I think this is like one of the pieces of the puzzle I'm trying to solve next is how do we bridge the gap between the physical medium of being able to write things down manually, which again, we've talked like for a lot of people actually does a lot more for memory retention and making things sticky. And you know, how that facilitates into like the digital realm so that you can then leverage that to, you know, do things like search and query and those sort of things. So does Obsidian let you hide the metadata? Yeah, so Larry, that's one of the things where I believe you can actually with, you might require some CSS tweaks, but what's nice about Obsidian is that it's entirely extensible. So people who are familiar with CSS and selectors, because it's basically just a web app, you can go in and do a lot of crazy customizations to make it basically perfect for you. So cool, Larry had that sent. Giannis has a question regarding the process with taking notes on more extensive long form learning. So if you want to learn a new tech framework, code snippets go. Yeah, so let me answer that question first. Regarding like long-term learning. So right now, for example, I'm learning about Golang. And so, and actually I'm saying Golang, but it's called Go by the community. And so the way I typically do it is I have like a landing page for like where everything is kind of central around. And so Nick Milo has this concept. He calls it maps of content, because they basically serve as like the anchor point to which you go out to different ideas. And so in here, for example, I can go ahead and you can see the relationships between Golang and the different things. And so when I was in this particular course, I was going through different sections of the curriculum and then checking them off. But then as I would dive into certain ones, they would have like different ideas that I felt were important to me. So in this case, like, you know, whether like a specific IDE was better for Golang. And then over time, you basically allows it to organically branch. And what's cool about this then is that as you start to get the habit of breaking notes into smaller chunks, and when you're writing blog posts, it becomes even easier to start assembling pieces, because you're just like, yeah, I'm going to grab it from here. And you know, and what's great about this sort of like tagging system too is that you can see where the ideas came from. And I don't know about you all, but that's a very important thing for me, to give credit where credit's due. I always feel a little bit queasy when I'll be like, oh, there's this wonderful article that someone recommended to me that was like life-changing, but I don't know who it was by. So yeah, just something that I've been thinking of. So, oh, code snippets. Sorry, that's a great point. The code snippet here, it takes code blocks because it's just markdown. So we can say it's Go, and then we can be like func, you know, num, you know, and then just like, and it just exists properly within it. So if you really wanted to share code blocks, I would just create a specific file with just the code block and then like pervade it out into the multiple documents. George, thoughts on Athens Research? Yeah, so for those who don't know, Athens Research is basically a competitor to Rome Research. And so I haven't gotten into the beta of it, but I have seen some previews of it. And it mirrors a lot of Rome in a lot of ways, but for some sort of similar reasons. um, I still prefer like the full ownership of having it like owning everything myself. And more importantly, my I'll call it one of the issues I draw with sort of third-party vendors that kind of draw you into vendor lock-in is that if and when the software ever like goes kaput, like the company decides it's not worth it anymore, like you're kind of left high and dry. And whereas like with Obsidian, all of these files in here that you see, they really are just text files. And so to me, I believe like this is really the model going forward because this means that one, because Obsidian is free and you can download it, this means that if as long as you have a computer that can run Obsidian 60 years from now, it doesn't matter if the developers stop working on it because you can still use the functionality. But the same cannot be said a lot of these online distributors where if they decide to close shop, sure you can extract a database of your things, but I don't know how many of you have tried that. That only works like to a certain extent. And let alone like if it works at all, because I've gotten like these, like, especially this is not quite the same thing, but I've like WordPress files that I'm trying to like figure out like, oh, it's a mess, and then you basically lose all the data because it's no longer accessible. Whereas like, by having some sort of, as long as I have a text editor now, I could still at least navigate through all these files and find the things I'm looking for. I might not have the beautiful graphs and stuff if I, for whatever reason, didn't have Obsidian, but my data is still kept in its integral form and still valid. And that to me is super important. Trey has the thing about public roadmap for Obsidian. Great, thanks for posting that. Um, and so, Obsidian templates. Yes, Eric. So at the moment, this is still in development, but I do have a basic Obsidian starter kit that I started developing on GitHub. But again, this is not in its full form. This is definitely alpha as far as I'm concerned, but I have included some of my snippets there. Matt, yep, reading Dune as well. That's awesome. Let's see. So actually, Hangsu did mention regarding standard file formats. This is actually what I had brought up before as well, is that when you have software that does custom things to it, you just, again, you have vendor lock-in, and I don't like vendor lock-in when it comes to your ideas, your brain. It's like, it's yours. You should own it. That's gonna be a podium I stand on for a long time. Let's see, Linda. Let's see. Mo, am I excited for Ben's very own note-taking app? Yeah, I am. I am thinking of things, so stay tuned for that for sure. It's not too much overhead to write a note because I would. Okay, so Lucas here. I think I would avoid creating lots of notes because of the work of filing metadata and properly categorizing it. So Lucas, one of the things I've developed over time is that you basically eventually figure out templates for how you're call it refactoring your notes. And that's one of the things I'm looking to make better about the experience with Obsidian, is because ideally when you refactor something and you want to bring it out to its own note, it should be as simple as like basically telling it in advance what it is, and it'll automatically fill it out. Right now, as you can tell, it's a little bit manual, other than templatizing things. And I personally believe it should be made a lot smarter than that. So again, those are things in development, but know that at least, and this is why I think it's powerful that Obsidian uses just text documents, is that it's still accessible to you rather than in some sort of database that unless you have the tools to pull it out, you're basically stuck. So fair enough, Lucas. I think hopefully as the note-taking experience get better, more people will kind of see the value in it. Cams, yes. So about out and about listening to podcasts or audiobooks. So there are a lot of services. The one in particular I do use is readwise.io. And what it does is it syncs all of the things in terms of like your Kindle podcast highlights, and it can bring them all in, and you can download them as markdown files. So basically, you basically probably see what I'm saying is that you can take those highlights and drop them into Obsidian, and then you're basically good to go, and which is awesome. And so, okay, let's see. Horatio here has a great comment here about note-taking, right? Evaluating which tool to invest time in and how it ends up being valuable. So when it comes to, in my opinion, when it comes to good note-taking, it's about having longevity. Because as we move in our lives through different areas and different concerns, right? Like I mentioned, I'm a serial hobbyist. I learn a lot of different things. If innovation lies at the intersection between different fields, then basically what we get here is like the ability to see relationships between things and like basically spread them out over time. And again, like I think that Obsidian can do other things to make, like, call it the metrics and graphs a little bit easier to navigate. But again, it's still in, not only is it in beta, but again, there's an opportunity to extend on top of it, which is one of the things I'm looking into. And so Horatio, a lot of note-taking that I've struggled with is that a lot of us focus on capture, basically like saving the information. But taking the time to process the information, I think, is often the missing key that a lot of us have when it comes to note taking, is because we ingest all this information and we don't try and really spend time to figure out how things relate. And so that's why, for example, in like the big tech example, right? If it was talking about like Google and stuff, like this is where I'd be like, interesting take on, and I would just tag Google in like this sort of link format, on its impact on search results and web standards, and like, and over time, like those insights can be fetched and queried. And so that's why, like, for me, it's basically, don't hesitate to try it out just for a little bit and see how it feels. Obsidian for me was fairly easy to get started because it's just a series of text files. So yeah, hopefully that helps to semi-answer your question, but happy to talk more about that later. Cool. Okay. And with that, I think we're over time a bit, but oh, we have some stuff in the Q&A. Awesome. All right, so I do want to answer some of these actually before we'll take the next 5 minutes, and then we will wrap up here. So Eli has a question here regarding thoughts on linking your thinking and creating maps of content flow. So I actually did take the linking your thinking workshop. And so overall, like, I think there's a lot of value in the ideas that Nick is basically starting to sort of push out into the note-taking ecosystem. Because again, like if we're talking about linking your thinking, it would be, I think, insincere to bring up the other very popular methodology that's out there right now, Tiago Forte's building a second brain. And so both have had quite revolutionary impacts, I think, from people who are new to these concepts in guiding them towards basically developing their own note-taking apps. And so all I can say really about them is that, like, it's as long as you understand the fundamentals behind them and understand that note-taking is about personalizing it to what makes the most sense for you, I think that's really the key to making it successful. Because the moment we try to force ourselves into someone's framework is when I usually find that it starts to lose its stickiness and helpfulness. So hopefully that helped. All right. So yeah. So Horatio again. So as far as which tools to invest time in, I would say, like, if you're just getting started, honestly, one of my favorite note-taking apps still is Notion. Even though recently they're having some performance issues with it, but if you're new and starting to experiment with things, Notion is absolutely wonderful for like getting a lot of bang for buck as far as built-in things, and collaboration is really well done. I would totally check out Marie Pullen's resources. She has so many. She has a whole course dedicated to it. But since you're just started, check out the YouTube series. Like, she's wonderful. So that is actually my answer to you. If you're new, just start with Notion and just figure out what's possible. See what you like. Let's see. And then Eli has a question here regarding folders. Some note takers advocate tags over folders. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those things, again, like, why are we using it in a specific way? So in Rome, for example, Rome doesn't have any concept of folders. But because Obsidian lives on your local computer and you actually have folders already, basically, I try to use folders as minimally as possible. And only group them when it makes sense. So again, a folder of templates really doesn't make sense to like belong in a series of ideas, right? Because templates are templates; they're just reusable pieces of text. Whereas everything in Zettelkasten, and that's like where my ideas start to live and grow and those sort of things. And so personally, I do try to use folders as little as possible. And then tags still are a great way to kind of compose and add sort of metadata to things. So thanks for the question, Eli. All right. Awesome. Well, in that case, yeah, I really appreciate you all spending the time here to sit and chat regarding note taking. So at the end of this, I don't have anything to sell y'all. I just really wanted to share this information with everyone. If you're looking again for me on the Internet of Things, you can find me under Ben Code Zen. Mainly, I'm very active on Twitter, so feel free to direct message me there if you want. But I'm going to be creating with more note-taking content and productivity on YouTube, so check that out. And if you're looking for a newsletter, I just got this set up. So if you go to buttondown.email/BenCodeZen, I can drop the link in the chat. That's basically a way to kind of keep up with things. So Yeah, again, if y'all have any questions or anything, would love to hear from y'all. And yeah, I'll try to get the next webinar set up so we can have more conversations. But thanks everyone for joining, and I really appreciate it.